Hello, my name is Carlos Velasco. This is for Music 309. Um, so, what comes to mind when you hear the word protest? Justice, freedom, unity. Perhaps images of political demonstrations come to mind, like sit ins and, um, like rioting in the streets or marches and whatnot. And, a common mantra that is usually repeated: change here, change now, Well, um, there are many forms of protest that one can demonstrate either through previously mentioned marching. There's other ones like obstruction of public areas, sit-in protest, hunger strikes, rioting, looting, vandalism of property, and so on. But there's another form that has the same power, and usually has a huge underlying message, and it's conveyed through music, and that is protest music. Um, in fact, in the United States alone, protest music has ever been so prevalent since the birth of the colonies in 1607. Today, we'll be mostly focusing on the U.S. protest music and how it changed over the course of U.S. history. Quite possibly, the first ever recorded mention of protest music in the States was the aforementioned, song from the 13 colonies, and that was Yankee Doodle in 1755. It was previously first a way of mocking the colonists, and they called them Hicks. They called them all that, Yankees, as they said. And we didn't like that so much, so we used it against the British when we fought them in the Revolutionary War. In fact, we actually played it. What the fuck? We played it. We played it. As a form of protest, really, because they were taxing our tea, and so we didn't want that. Anyway, much later, when American music started to become, broadcasted in the radio in the early 1900s, that meant that music was finally being able to play more broadly, which meant more airway, which meant that artists can actually talk about the subject matter that they wanted to and reach a really large audience. With the ability to send messages in their songs, artists took it upon themselves to write songs about issues that pertain to them more specifically. A lot of African American artists actually talk about slavery in most of their songs during this time. One such thing was, I believe it was Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. That was more so around 1959, if I'm not mistaken. And the song talked about the brutal beatings that occurred and the lynchings that occurred in the South. In fact, it was so brutal that it was taken off the airways. Uh, and so people during that time either heard of it through word of mouth or actually heard the song. It was the first time, or one of the first times, that a song such as that would be censored in the radio. Much later, in the early 1960s, protest music really began to take form with Bob Dylan's Times Are Changing, because so much happened in the early 1960s. Not only did we have a civil rights movement with, Martin Luther King Jr. Leading it to the forefront, but we also had the start of the Vietnam War and the U.S. government being involved in the war and the Cold War and whatnot, and so on and so forth. So much was going on during this time that a song like "Times Are Changing" by Bob Dylan really struck with a lot of audiences and a lot of listeners, and they used that quite a bit to unify a lot of people during this time. The 1960s also saw the rise of rock and roll, with bands such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones making it ever so prevalent. One such band, Creedence Clearwater Revival, actually wrote a song called Fortunate Son, which is about the Vietnam War and how most Americans had to partake in the Vietnam War because they weren't the fortunate sons. Not a lot of people had rich fathers, and they weren't fortunate sons. Obviously, the song now is synonymous with the Vietnam War, and a lot of people think about the Vietnam War in tandem with Fortunate Son. So it's safe to say that a lot of these songs still impact people to this day. Besides the American political stuff overseas, there was still a lot of racial discrimination occurring in the 1960s and 70s. Um, and one such song called What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, released in 1971, touched upon those issues. Not just on racial discrimination, but just, you know, a lot of problems in America in general, like poverty, social class instability, war, and so on. And obviously, a lot of people resonated with it because a lot of people went through that same problem. There's this theme going on right now, and it's unity with most of these protest songs because obviously it's a critique on what is wrong in the system. But what makes it so beautiful is the fact that these artists are taking it upon themselves to write songs about them and have people listen to it, sing them in these protests. And then much later, in the 1980s, we saw the rise of pop punk and punk and their status quo challenge against what was supposed to be right and everything. Obviously, it started in the UK, then it obviously started to flourish a little in the US, and then we saw the rise of female pop punk bands or punk bands, and it was beautiful because um, most of what protest music was challenging the status quo and critiquing what was wrong and changing something. And that's what made punk great. And then in the 90s, we saw the rise of grunge and hip hop. And in the 90s, one synonymous song that a lot of people loved during the MTV era was Fuck the Police by NWA. Obviously, there was a lot of police brutality. The thing that happened in LA, the 1993 LA riots, a lot of people used that song in order to protest against the police brutalities that were occurring during the time. And so, even then, still lots and lots of usage of protest music. Finally, today, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's one song by Kendrick Lamar used as "All Right." In fact, some people during this time or during the Black Lives Matter movement would use "All Right" and chant it as a way to unify protesters. So in reality, protest music back then, since the start of the nation, and even now, is still very important because it unifies us. It's used during times of uncertainty, during political wars and social inequity. It's used during times of emotional turmoil towards issues of that is far greater than one man can ever withstand alone. It's used to express anger and discontent towards a system that is so unfair and favors some but ignores others completely. But most importantly, it's used to unite and strengthen humanity and bring us closer. And with the use of music, the message can forever remain as long as it's continued to be played. So yeah, thank you so much for watching.